Welcome to Sheth Marketing Academy. This lecture is in the international marketing area, and the title of the lecture is Think Local, Act Global. It's opposite of what we have been currently practicing, Think Global, Act Local, or Glocal as it is called, which I think as a paradigm is giving way to this new paradigm. As you know, in international marketing, for the last 40-50 years, we have done a lot of research, and companies have gone globally basically since World War II essentially. And the first research was primarily why some products succeed here and fail there or fizzle there. And the thinking was that it has to do with cultural factors. Cultures vary, and therefore consumers and customers may not be as willing to accept Western products by and large. Then we went into the country of image research, especially made in Japan, which used to be poor quality image, and how that impacts the selling of products into the Western world. We had made in Taiwan, made in Hong Kong, made in Korea even now. As you know, Japanese transformed that image completely by investing as a nation into the quality initiatives and almost became number one in quality in the world. Similar initiatives are taking place now in China, which is a major export-oriented economy, and also to some extent in India. All of this research was then very heavily impacted by one classic paper written by Professor Theodore Levitt at Harvard University. In 1983, he teed up the idea that these cultural differences, consumption differences are not as important, especially when technology is standardizing the worldwide markets. And he talked about the appliances industry, the automotive industry, the consumer electronics industry, etc., where the supply chain standardization led to product homogeneity and marketing of the products in the same way all over the world. And that article became very controversial, whether the distance between the advanced countries and emerging markets still matters, or actually the world is a lot more becoming homogeneous, at least from a marketing perspective. Counterbalancing his argument was a compromise: think global, act local. In other words, Ted Levitt's view was that you must think global, act global, which was modified to think global, act local, or glocal as I mentioned. Honda was the automobile maker who teed up that idea that we still have to localize the product design, the fuel efficiency standards. While you may have a global architecture about branding, global architecture about the components, etc., you still need to localize it. That paradigm is the one that is giving way now to a new paradigm called think local, act global, mostly because of the rise of emerging markets. So let me take this slide here to show you that the next paradigm in international marketing is think global, act local, which is the old paradigm, to think local, act global. Why is this happening? This is happening again for the same fundamental reason which is transforming the world, that the future of markets and competition and sourcing is all emerging markets. Emerging markets are going to be the drivers of economies for everybody, not just for emerging economies corporations, but also for all advanced countries. Whether you are a Caterpillar on the one hand, or whether you are a General Electric, or whether you are a Unilever, Nestle, Kraft Foods, doesn't make any difference. So that's the focus of this particular lecture. There are 4 characteristics of emerging markets that are coming in the play, which I think will require this change in the way we think. One must think locally, innovate for the local markets, and then see the opportunity for that all over the world. The first major factor is the reality of emerging markets. So, what is the reality? The first major reality of all emerging markets, just outside of metro area in China, just outside of all the cities in India, lots of African countries in general except for the capital maybe, so true in Latin America, any emerging economies or transition economies, is that the markets are highly localized. Or we have what we call bazaars. Bazaars is the place where the producers come and meet the consumers, very much like in the Western countries what we would call the farmers market. Once a week, local farmers bring their produce, and you have the local patrons who come and buy those products, enjoy, consume, etc. So, localized bazaars is a very key concept. It is not limited to fresh produce, but for example, snacks. There is an enormous amount of unbranded snacks all over the world. It's sold, it's made by a vendor or a producer who brings it to the market, just sitting on the street. Similar to sometimes we find products that are pirated, like the movies and the music CDs and the DVDs, sold on the streets, quite a few places in the traditional markets. So, as I mentioned, fresh produce, snacks, and when you analyze it, those are pretty significant markets, and each local market has something unique different. The heterogeneity or the uniqueness of those markets is fantastic to observe, almost like an anthropological market odyssey research that one can do. Second major aspects of the reality of emerging markets is entrenched distribution. So, in this case, to enter the market itself is very difficult. If you have a Western product, you need to invent the product, innovate the product locally, and see if you can adapt it to the local distribution. I found this to be very true, for example, in agricultural chemicals, where even the largest of the companies have to go through a distributor company who is their own competitor quite often. They are other manufacturer or pharmaceutical companies or agricultural chemical companies. You have multiple middlemen. The level of middlemen involved in emerging markets is mind-boggling. In some cases I have found they have almost 11 middlemen from the producer to the consumer. And each of these middlemen actually is a gatekeeper in some fashion or the more, so there is a huge market inefficiency. Understanding that market inefficiency, overcoming that requires local understanding. In other words, thinking more locally makes more sense than thinking globally. Second major dimension is enormous intra-market diversity, or what we call heterogeneity. The market heterogeneity is much greater because there is no real middle class. We have all classes from extremely poor to extremely rich, and those are getting more and more distributed wider and wider, and therefore the mean or the average makes no sense. What we have to understand is the variance or the range, and the range is just mind-boggling when you visit any emerging economy. Of course, how does this diversity arise? It arises by languages, such as in India, which has at least 14 major languages whose syntax is different, alphabets are different, and each language has 500 to 1,000 dialects. And on top of them, there are languages which are not even written languages, just spoken languages, which is mind-boggling when you visit India. The diversity is probably 3 to 5 times more complex than the European diversity in languages that we see. After all, the alphabets are basically the same, whether it's a Spanish language, French language, Scandinavian, German, or the English. That's not the case. In fact, in India, the currency has to print 14 times the denomination, because each subculture has its own linguistic preference by and large. There is no real national language in that regard. You have a similar geographical diversity in Indonesia, for example. Thousands of islands, very widespread geography, which creates enormous market access issues. You have a similar diversity geographically in Africa, even though it's one continent, but it is a huge continent. Of course, you have an enormous faith diversity both in Africa as well as in the Middle East. There is no one single faith really, but you have multiple faiths, and therefore it varies enormously. So enormous intra-market diversity is the second reason why we have to think more local and then act global. Third, and we have a lot of research done on what's called the bottom of the pyramid. I like the word base of the pyramid. The base of the pyramid is those who earn less than $2 per day income according to United Nations benchmark or a definition. And when you look at that market, totally unorganized, highly local, highly fragmented, it exceeds already about $4 trillion. And surprisingly, it is growing, except it is growing from unbranded to branded products, but all local. It is not as if the foreign brands or multinationals are taking over. They are trying, but the vast majority is right now unbranded products and services are becoming more and more branded, all local, and I'll give you some examples later on. Third key area with the bottom of the pyramid or base of the pyramid market, which is a very large economy, is accessibility and affordability challenges. And by the way, those markets, as I mentioned, access is a key problem, affordability is another key problem. They don't have the buying power, although they have the consumption desire or a need. I do want to go back and mention to you that recently McKinsey came out with a report published in McKinsey Quarterly that the total emerging market by 2025 will be at least $30 trillion and will surpass all of the advanced economies. In fact, it will surpass all of the advanced economies as early as 2020 roughly. But it's a very large market potential, and therefore every major international or multinational corporation, especially from Western advanced economies, from Japan to Germany to France to America, has to participate in that market. And hence this lecture becomes much more strategic, much more important. The fourth area, and the one that has made this enormous shift about thinking locally, acting globally, is that there is an enormous amount of local entrepreneurship and innovation. This has come as a surprise to all of the multinationals. They thought that the emerging markets will have neither entrepreneurship nor innovation, but this has been proven wrong. Not only that, some of those entrepreneurs and some of those innovations have gone global. So here are a couple of examples. First one, and a very important one, is that Tata as a company, a large Indian business conglomerate. They seem to be in every business. People have already talked about the Tata's Nano car, a major transformation in the automobile design and manufacturing and assembly. But they have another initiative called Swachh Water, which means the pure water or water that is true. In most of these economies, they don't have municipalization of the water. Water from the rivers and the canals is highly contaminated. Lots of diseases that we know come from water, contaminated water primarily. So there is also a social agenda built into this innovation. How can we purify the water at the local water pump? Is it possible? And these kinds of innovations are coming that people had never thought about. So it's not the traditional bottled water, which is of course is happening, but this is slightly quite different. Local medicine in China still probably is the most dominant medicine. It is not the Western pharmaceuticals which are growing, but typically Chinese population, including educated class, still believes in the traditional medicine. In fact, a brand name called Tiger Balm, based in Singapore, has become one of the major alternatives to the traditional medicine and has been a multi-million dollar corporation or a business selling products all over the world, primarily into alternate health centers or into the ethnic populations from Asia. Another brand that has done exceptionally well in the snack area in India is Haldiram. Haldirams, as it is called, and they basically what they used to do unbranded, they packaged into the with modern packaging, and it has become a very large export market for them. Not just in the ethnic markets of Indian origin, such as in England, for example, or in America or in Africa, but surprisingly, it is now becoming mainstream supermarket distribution product also. We all know about the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, that again was accessing a rural market. In this case, how do you lend money, or micro lending as it is called, to people who are so poor? It is also called the unbanked sector. The traditional banks could never reach them, could never think, because they don't have a credit rating. Most unique innovation was that you make a family of 10, 11 people in a very small village community, and each one is responsible for making sure that the other family who has borrowed the money as a group, as a cooperative borrowing, is able to pay or must pay. In other words, social compliance is a lot more powerful than legal compliance in some fashion, or a contractual law between a bank, a lender, and a borrower. And by the way, Grameen Bank itself is nothing less than what is very prevalent in all of the Asian countries, and I'm sure it's true in Latin America also. This whole unbanked sector has financing available, which in India is called the chit. Chit is basically a promissory note. In the South alone, it is probably $5 to $10 billion industry in India. Totally in India, we think this market of having a lending done by people into the small towns, either to the merchant, for example, to finance a truck driver, even a rickshaw wala, or a three-wheeler scooter, they're all owner operators or agents who try to distribute products, what we call merchant consumers in some fashion. They all have financing needs, and the traditional banking sector is unable to do. Chit is now becoming much more organized at the same time. So the fundamental message is that lots of innovation, lots of entrepreneurship is taking place, and therefore we need to understand, we need to participate to be competitive. By the way, this is nothing new. You have the brands like Inca Cola out of Peru, made from a local herb, an absolutely successful competitor against Coca-Cola, which otherwise dominates Latin America or dominates the world for that matter. That brand was almost equal in market share. Local patronage, local belief systems, and therefore how do you duplicate that idea? How do you imitate surprisingly? Is a key question in the case of Inca Cola. Since Coca-Cola could not compete into the markets that they were competing, such as Peru and Latin America or Central America, Coca-Cola ended up buying the brand. Same thing is true as Vita Soy, Vitasoi, based in Hong Kong but meant for the Chinese population, where you have the, I would say, soybean, which adds protein in the body, gives you enormous lift in the body, therefore just like caffeine does or sugar does, was very fascinating, hopefully more nutritional, and that brand eventually was bought out by, through acquisitions, by Quaker Oats, and eventually it is a part in fact of the Pepsi. So how do we succeed in thinking locally, acting globally. My view is that first of all it is a necessity now. The traditional notion of think global, act global is not sustainable, nor is the notion of think global, act local, which was great when we had these emerging markets were peripheral. But when emerging markets become core markets to the future of a company, as I mentioned, all the way from Unilever to McDonald's to even Walmart maybe, just goes on and on, banking sector in general, in that case we need to think local, act global. So here are 6 different strategies and initiatives. And I think this is the recipe for successfully implementing think local, act global. Focus on affordability. This is nothing new again. Anytime a society goes from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, as America did, let's say in late 1800s beginning, and definitely in the early 1900s, this was the pioneering effort in America. From, for example, Henry Ford's idea of making a very affordable car, to Eastman Kodak's idea about in fact making a affordable camera, to having ideas of making affordable anything. Because again, in the transition economy from agriculture to industrial, Americans didn't have a buying power. They were all either making themselves value add in daily consumption or buying from a local vendor, highly unorganized. So focus on affordability. And how has it been done? Very simple idea, like typical shampoo bottle is just too expensive as a unit price. So somebody in India came out with the idea, why not package the shampoo into a single use? It's not just affordability, but operational compatibility, because in rural markets there is no running water quite often. In rural markets there is no place to put your shampoo bottle. Think about all those operational details. So this is very portable and you use it, it's affordable, it's compatible with daily operations. And today I am told what began with a brand called Kevin Care in India, actually the biggest market for single-use shampoo is now Mexico, and surprisingly it is also the most profitable product line for companies that sell shampoos. Second thing is that we have to have creative financing to make it affordable. As we said, micro lending became very key, but the biggest idea around here in subsistence economies, as one of my colleagues has talked about, is to convert consumers into merchants, which means you have to increase their livelihood. As you increase their livelihood and lend money for that, they become also consumers who can afford and therefore have greater income to buy. Their buying power goes up. It also requires, for affordability, local innovation. Taking something from the Western countries in the way we design products, in the way we invent, in the way we make them, and then try to adopt and make it affordable is much more difficult than thinking from the beginning where you create a product with a price, market price as the objective upfront. Can you do it under that price? And you see breakthrough innovations coming about all over the world now, and that's the excitement. Second area is innovate for accessibility. As I said, accessibility is the other key problem area. And we already talked about the Grameen Bank before, which made the money lending accessible. Unbanked sector is a very large sector even in America. We have done a research through India China America Institute in this area, and we find it is not only a large sector in China and in India obviously, but also in the US. In many advanced countries you have that lower income consumers who have no access because they have no credit or a poor credit, and therefore how do you finance the daily living, or how do you make them into merchants of some sort? We do have, for example, phenomenon like the banks will be in those neighborhoods who will say, bring your check, paycheck, and I will cash it for you, right? We have those kinds of money lenders. We have pawn shops, but how do you make it even better and more legitimate in the sense and still earn good returns is the whole area. So one can do accessibility. And I tell you, the best place where I've seen accessibility done is by the cell phone operators all over the world. Any part of the world, rural, most remote place, surprisingly you will find some merchant selling cell phones or activating your service. And the reason why this has happened is that cell phone operators were mandated by law that if they want the license, they cannot just serve the urban markets, highly population density, more buying power, but they also have to serve the rural markets. So they had to put the architecture in place, the networks, they had to put the towers in place. So the infrastructure is ready. Pretty much it's a question of now having shops to sell. And if you go to some of these countries, you will be amazed the kinds of shops that sell cell phone services. I mean, they're very traditional shops selling nothing more than, let's say, Coca-Cola type products or local made snacks, for example, soaps and detergents, sort of the daily convenience things that we buy. And they also sell cell phone services, and which is a mind-boggling change I've seen. In India, for example, our cell phone market has already grown more than 700 million subscribers and growing every month by about 20 to 25 million, all in the lower socioeconomic base of the pyramid rural markets. It's also same thing is true in China as it is in Africa. I was blown away a couple of years ago when I visited Africa, especially East Africa, in Tanzania and Kenya, in the game resorts or safari, where it's only animals, but in the middle of this Serengeti National Park, you have a complete cell phone service coverage almost to the 3G level. Airtel from India through acquisition is present. Vodafone, another major multinational, is present anywhere in the world. So this is accessibility. The third thing one has to do is to do a lot more improvisation. Things happen by trial and error. There is no formula. This fits very well in innovation because most innovation is actually not as predictable, not as planned like, let's say, classical music, but it is more like jazz. You have to improvise constantly, and the more you do improvisation, better the jazz music becomes or the musician becomes. So it's iterative process, very much like software, first generation, second generation. And you have to do this under resource constraints, which means you may not have access to talented scientists, you may not have access to, in fact, market. Markets may be regulated by price by the government for social objectives or highly subsidized even, such as for grains like rice, wheat, sugarcane, etc. They are all what you call political crops. But drugs is a very key area. Western approach to making drugs is so expensive. To have a blockbuster drug, including clinical trials for safety as well as for efficacy or side effects and efficacy, is about $1 billion investment upfront. Of course, $1 billion is a lot more money. That in these countries you don't have those kinds of resources, not just money but even the talent, so you come out with generic drugs. And the generic drugs have become a major phenomenon all out of the emerging markets, especially India and China, and now you know generic drugs are all over the world. In fact, all Western countries which are struggling with their healthcare obligations, especially governments, or in the case of United States, the insurance and the corporations are now strongly encouraging that the older population, especially those who are retirees, will be, even though you prescribe a regular pharma ethical proprietary drug, the retailer or the pharmacist will give you a generic drug. And they are not made in America. So in many ways this is reverse innovation, but I think reverse innovation gives you a different connotation. My view is that this means you have a local entrepreneur such as Dr. Reddy's in India, Nicholas Pyramid Group, I can give you a dozen names out of the Indian pharmaceutical industry who have become, by thinking locally, serving the local market, finding a product, coming out with same side effects and efficacy, getting it certified for the Western markets, starting locally and then going internationally. Very similar to what Japan did at one time, export orientation, but start with the local market first rather than the export market first. You have the same thing about rural healthcare in Africa, and online education is a big wave happening, surprisingly far ahead of advanced countries into emerging markets. You see online education companies, I am talking about government non-profit companies or for profit, having as much as 3 million, 4 million students studying higher education. And what is possible in higher education, we think eventually can also happen and will happen into primary and secondary education. Next area is fusion of marketing practices. It is not that one is right and the other is wrong. You need to combine both Western and the local traditions. And examples fusion would be, now you take a mobile technology, which obviously is Western invention, especially America. They invented here, commercialized it properly, and now going internationally, both the set manufacturers, handset manufacturers, infrastructure, even as service operators, but more innovation is taking place in Kenya, which probably has become the leader in the world on what we call mobile payments, because they bypass the computer age on the one hand, but they are bypassing the traditional banking sector. Traditional banks without credit ratings will not go into markets that are not even rated or no access. So now you have your mobile phone with an illiterate person, and he or she has learned with a few pressing of the buttons can actually have a bank in their hands. Taking off, everybody is watching that experiment, and what works in Kenya will also work in Malaysia, will also work in Thailand, will work in Indonesia, will work in India, rest of the emerging markets. Blended R&D, we have seen the best happening in terms of fusion of marketing practices is to blend the local understanding with global understanding. It is not like the local guys know everything and global guys don't. It is really a blend of the two. And we have clearly seen this thing in arts and entertainment. Hollywood on the one hand and Bollywood on the other hand, or journalism in general. The blending is a key concept. And social media, we have seen this thing. And of course, we now have online dating essentially. Online dating is much bigger market and better market, and they are improvising in a way locally and then taking globally, such as what is called the Shadi.com. That is an Indian dating. Shadi means marriage. So if you want to get married, not just date, this is the portal you come, and eligible people sort of, it's a matchmaking. Now think about this one. In countries like India or many emerging economies, local newspapers, local advertising used to be all about matrimonials, as they call it, where the parents will advertise and say, I have an eligible son, I have an eligible daughter, here are the qualifications, here is the caste system, here is the faith religious system. If you are somebody looking for your daughter or son to get married, send us a mail. Well, what was done by mail or word of mouth today is all social media and dating, I guess, portals essentially by and large. And absolutely incredible to see the West and the East, or the more traditional societies and very advanced societies coming together on a given objective or a given marketing practice. Next one is, as we have talked about, reverse innovation. A lot of literature is coming out on this one. Has become a major platform at companies like General Electric, especially in medical instruments, and to some extent into their other businesses. Similarly true about the Embraer, which is a Brazilian aircraft maker. They are building aircraft for the local market, but then they would like to have an export market. In India, same thing, they are putting a lot of small car capacity. India has become one of the largest, in fact, the largest automotive component supplier for small cars in the world. But they put a capacity in India for million cars, not because million cars is the demand for that brand within India, but maybe 60% for the local consumption design, but the other 40% is export market, where there is a global market for the same vehicle, for the same design, for the same style, etc., etc. And we have found the same thing about, for example, ethnic cuisines, which is the older model. I mean, think about Italian pizza. The way it is improvised in India is very unique. The way it is improvised in America is very unique. But you have the concept which comes from Italy as the originator, or similarly Chinese noodles or Chinese restaurants, Thai restaurants. It's a matter of, so I think what in ethnic foods people have done, which is think local, act global, I think is very appropriate for more technology products, more industrial products, and more consumer durables, not just food, but also for everything that we consume and we market. And the last area, and my favorite, is that in order to understand this think local, act global, you must think about climate. As you know, with the colonial expansion in the 1400s, most of the differences we looked at were east-west expansion, which means as far above the equator, if you came from Scandinavia, Germany, you found a land or soil where you could plant your technologies, agricultural, or as far south of equator. But more interesting has been to understand north-south axis, where climate changes dramatically. It has a consumption on everything in life we do. So if you take shoes, for example, in the Arctic climate of Scandinavia, you have to wear boots with maybe 2 pairs of socks. As you go to our little more warmer climate, let's say Mediterranean, basically, or slightly less than Mediterranean, boots become shoes, shoes become sandals as you come to our tropical, and sandals become basically tongs. Very interesting. I mean, you can see that predictable pattern by climate. So if you want to think local, act global, you may find within a climatic zone, whatever in local innovation or product you create, you have a market worldwide. And I've seen this thing for shoes, for shelter, the same thing. Northern Europeans, the resource you will have to build homes or commercial buildings is primarily mountains, rocks, or trees, forest. So wood and stones are very prevalent. As you go to the warmer climates, it becomes clay oriented. Same thing is true about the design of the roofs. Roofs have to be A-shaped so the snow falls off, otherwise it will destroy the roof. In warmer climates, the roof are more flat for the rain gently to drop off. Indoor, outdoor, every architect will tell you the indoor and the outdoor has to be insulated, and there has to be a transition area, which is what we call, when we walk into a room, the foyer, from extreme cold to a normal temperature or vice versa. And therefore, you have a design where the outdoor and the indoor are shut from each other. In warmer climates like the Mediterranean villas, for example, or the Spanish villas, etc., you find indoor, outdoor totally sort of, you cannot tell apart where is the outdoor, where is the indoor, as it is true in, let's say, Arizona or in California in America. I think that's very interesting to understand. It is true for every food I have analyzed, beverages I have analyzed, shoes that I mentioned, products like cheese, also true of shelter products, also true in fact of clothing at the same time. It's a very, very powerful universal observation, and becomes very good in terms of innovating locally, marketing locally, and then taking it abroad. By the way, that's true of tractors. The tractors in a muddy road needs engine that has to be dust proof in some fashion. And even though it was a Western licensed technology by one of the Indian companies, they modified the engine to suit the Indian climate, very hot, very tropical, as well as dusty, and then sell all that to Africa in a very big way. And I have seen the same thing about a telephone switch, digital switch. Digital switches are very sensitive like servers. You have to have an air conditioned rooms. In many of these emerging economies, they don't even have electricity, but you got to have a switch out in the rural market. And what they've done is to come out with a digital switch that is locally climatically adaptable. All industrial products, industrial raw materials, they understand this thing, because as you make products from raw materials or components, they have to be climatically compatible. So climate is the last recommendation to watch. So let's conclude this lecture. The old model of think global, act local or glocal in international marketing is now shifting to think local, act global, almost the reverse way. This is due to growth of emerging markets with enormous cultural diversity, large base of the pyramid market, and lots of local innovation and entrepreneurship, which is creating enormous value and wealth to the society as well as to the entrepreneurs. This will therefore shift in innovative marketing with a focus on affordability, accessibility, and resource constrained improvisation. Not just improvisation in product design, but improvisation of all 4 P's of marketing: pricing, distribution, promotion, advertising. It's all improvisation. It will also encourage fusion of marketing practices and reverse innovation. As I mentioned before, climate is the ultimate key to successfully implement think local, act global. Thank you very much.